This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Kristin Hughes. This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Book 2, The Education of a Personage. Chapter 3, Young Irony. Part 2. The End of Summer. No wind is stirring in the grass, not one wind stirs. The water in the hidden pools, as glass, fronts the full moon and so inters the golden token in its icy mass. Chanted Eleanor to the trees that skeletoned the body of the night. Isn't it ghostly here? If you can hold your horse's feet up, let's cut through the woods and find the hidden pools. It's after 1, and you'll get the devil, he objected. I don't know enough about horses to put one away in the pitch dark. Shut up, you old fool, she whispered irreverently, and leaning over, she patted him lazily with her riding crop. You can leave your old plug in our stable, and I'll send him over tomorrow. But my uncle has got to drive me to the station with this old plug at 7 o'clock. Don't be a spoil-sport, remember? You have a tendency toward wavering that prevents you from being the entire light of my life. Amory drew up his horse close beside, and leaning toward her, grasped her hand. Say I am quick, or I'll pull you over and make you ride behind me. She looked up and smiled and shook her head excitedly. Oh, do, or rather don't. Why are all the exciting things so uncomfortable? Like fighting and exploring and skiing in Canada. By the way, we're going to ride up Harper's Hill. I think that comes in our program about 5 o'clock. You little devil, Amory growled. You're going to make me stay up all night and sleep in the train like an immigrant all day tomorrow going back to New York. Hush, someone's coming along the road. Let's go. Woo-yoop! And with a shout that probably gave the belated traveler a series of shivers, she turned her horse into the woods and Amory followed slowly, as he had followed her all day for 3 weeks. The summer was over, but he had spent the days in watching Eleanor, a graceful, facile Manfred, build herself intellectual and imaginative pyramids while she revelled in the artificialities of the temperamental teens, and they wrote poetry at the dinner table. When vanity kissed vanity 100 happy Junes ago, he pondered o'er her breathlessly, and that all men might ever know, he rhymed her eyes with life and death. Through time I'll save my love, he said, yet beauty vanished with his breath, and with her lovers she was dead. Ever his wit and not her eyes, ever his art and not her hair. Who'd learned a trick in rhyme, be wise, and pause before his sonnet there. So all my words, however true, might sing you to 1,000th June, and no one ever know that you were beauty for an afternoon. So he wrote one day, and he pondered how coldly we thought of the dark lady of the sonnets, and how little we remembered her as the great man wanted her remembered. For what Shakespeare must have desired to have been able to write with such divine despair was that the lady should live, and now we have no real interest in her. The irony of it is that if he had cared more for the poem than for the lady, the sonnet would be only obvious, imitative rhetoric, and no one would ever have read it after 20 years. This was the last night Amory ever saw Eleanor. He was leaving in the morning, and they had agreed to take a long farewell trot by the cold moonlight. She wanted to talk, she said, perhaps the last time in her life that she could be rational. She meant pose with comfort. So they had turned into the woods and rode for half an hour with scarcely a word, except when she whispered damn at a bothersome branch, whispered it as no other girl was ever able to whisper it. Then they started up Harper's Hill, walking their tired horses. Good Lord, it's quiet here, whispered Eleanor. Much more lonesome than the woods. I hate woods, Amory said, shuddering. Any kind of foliage or underbrush at night. Out here, it's so broad and easy on the spirit. The long slope of a long hill, and the cold moon rolling moonlight down it, and thee and me last and most important. It was quiet that night. The straight road they followed up to the edge of the cliff knew few footsteps at any time. Only an occasional Negro cabin, silver-gray in the rock-ribbed moonlight, broke the long line of bare ground. Behind lay the black edge of the woods, like a dark frosting on a white cake, and ahead the sharp, high horizon. It was much colder, so cold that it settled on them and drove all the warm nights from their minds. "The end of summer," said Eleanor softly. "Listen to the beat of our horses' hooves, tump-tump, tump-a-tump. Have you ever been feverish and had all noises divide into tump-tump-tump until you could swear eternity was divisible into so many tumps? That's the way I feel. Old horses go tump-tump. I guess that's the only thing that separates horses and clocks from us. Human beings can't go tump-tump-tump without going crazy." The breeze freshened and Eleanor pulled her cape around her and shivered. "Are you very cold?" asked Amory. "No, I'm thinking about myself. My black old inside self. The real one. With the fundamental honesty that keeps me from being absolutely wicked by making me realize my own sins." They were riding up close by the cliff and Amory gazed over. Where the fall met the ground 100 feet below, a black stream made a sharp line, broken by tiny glints in the swift water. "Rotten, rotten old world," broke out Eleanor suddenly. "And the wretchedest thing of all is me. Oh, why am I a girl? Why am I not a stupid... Look at you. You're stupider than I am. Not much, but some. And you can lope about and get bored and then lope somewhere else. And you can play around with girls without being involved in meshes of sentiment. And you can do anything and be justified. And here am I, with the brains to do everything, yet tied to the sinking ship of future matrimony. If I were born 100 years from now, well and good. But now what's in store for me? I have to marry. That goes without saying. Who? I'm too bright for most men. And yet I have to descend to their level and let them patronize my intellect in order to get their attention. Every year that I don't marry, I've got less chance for a first-class man. At the best, I can have my choice from 1 or 2 cities, and of course I have to marry into a dinner coat." "Listen." She leaned close again. "I like clever men and good-looking men. And of course, no one cares more for personality than I do. Oh, just 1 person in 50 has any glimmer of what sex is. I'm hipped on Freud and all that, but it's rotten that every bit of real love in the world is 99% passion and one little soupçon of jealousy." She finished as suddenly as she began. "Of course you're right," Amory agreed. "It's a rather unpleasant, overpowering force that's part of the machinery under everything. It's like an actor that lets you see his mechanics. Wait a minute till I think this out." He paused and tried to get a metaphor. They had turned the cliff and were riding along the road about 50 feet to the left. "You see, everyone's got to have some cloak to throw around it. The mediocre intellects, Plato's second class, use the remnants of romantic chivalry diluted with Victorian sentiment, and we who consider ourselves the intellectuals cover it up by pretending that it's another side of us and has nothing to do with our shining brains. We pretend that the fact that we realize it is really absolving us from being a prey to it. But the truth is that sex is right in the middle of our purest abstractions, so close that it obscures vision. I can kiss you now and will." He leaned toward her in his saddle, but she drew away. I can't kiss you now. I'm more sensitive." You're more stupid, then," he declared rather impatiently. "Intellect is no protection from sex any more than convention is—" "What is?" she fired up. "The Catholic Church or the maxims of Confucius?" Amory looked up, rather taken aback. "That's your panacea, isn't it?" she cried. "Oh, you're just an old hypocrite, too. Thousands of scowling priests keep the degenerate Italians and illiterate Irish repentant with the gabble-gabble about the 6th and 9th commandments. It's just all cloaks, sentiment, and spiritual rouge and panaceas. I'll tell you, there is no God, not even a definite abstract goodness. So it's all got to be worked out for the individual by the individual here in high white foreheads like mine. And you're too much the prig to admit it." She let go her reins and shook her little fists at the stars. "If there is a God, let him strike me! Strike me!" "Talking about God again after the manner of atheists," Amory said sharply. His materialism, always a thin cloak, was torn to shreds by Eleanor's blasphemy. She knew it, and it angered him that she knew it. "And like most intellectuals who don't find faith convenient," he continued coldly, "like Napoleon and Oscar Wilde and the rest of your type, you'll yell loudly for a priest on your deathbed." Eleanor drew her horse up sharply, and he reined in beside her. "Will I?" she said in a queer voice that scared him. "Will I? Watch! I'm going over the cliff!" And before he could interfere, she had turned and was riding breakneck for the end of the plateau. He wheeled and started after her, his body like ice, his nerves in a vast clangor. There was no chance of stopping her. The moon was under a cloud, and her horse would step blindly over. Then, some 10 feet from the edge of the cliff, she gave a sudden shriek and flung herself sideways, plunged from her horse, and rolling over twice, landed in a pile of brush 5 feet from the edge. The horse went over with a frantic whinny. In a minute he was by Eleanor's side and saw that her eyes were open. "Eleanor!" he cried. She did not answer, but her lips moved and her eyes filled with sudden tears. "Eleanor, are you hurt?" "No, I don't think so," she said faintly, and then began weeping. "My horse dead?" "Good God, yes." "Oh," she wailed. "I thought I was going over. I didn't know." He helped her gently to her feet and boosted her onto his saddle. So they started homeward, Amory walking and she bent forward on the pommel, sobbing bitterly. "I've got a crazy streak," she faltered. "Twice before I've done things like that. When I was 11, Mother went mad, stark raving crazy. We were in Vienna." All the way back she talked haltingly about herself, and Amory's love waned slowly with the moon. At the door they started from habit to kiss goodnight, but she could not run into his arms, nor were they stretched to meet her as in the week before. For a minute they stood there, hating each other with a bitter sadness. But as Amory had loved himself in Eleanor, so now what he hated was only a mirror. Their poses were strewn about the pale lawn like broken glass. The stars were long gone, and there were left only the little sighing gusts of wind and the silences between. But naked souls are poor things ever, and soon he turned homeward and let new lights come in with the sun. A poem that Eleanor sent Amory several years later. Here, earthborn, over the lilt of the water, lisping its music and bearing a burden of light, bosoming day as a laughing and radiant daughter, here we may whisper unheard, unafraid of the night. Walking alone, was it splendor or what we were bound with? Deep in the time when summer lets down her hair, shadows we loved and the patterns they covered the ground with, tapestries, mystical, faint in the breathless air. That was the day, and the night for another story, pale as a dream and shadowed with penciled trees. Ghosts of the stars came by who had sought for glory, whispered to us of peace in the plaintive breeze, whispered of old dead faiths that the day had shattered, youth the penny that brought delight of the moon. That was the urge that we knew and the language that mattered. That was the debt that we paid to the usurer June. Here, deepest of dreams, by the waters that bring not anything back of the past that we need not know, what if the light is but sun and the little streams sing not? We are together. It seems I have loved you so. What did the last night hold, with the summer over, drawing us back to the home in the changing glade? What leered out of the darkness in the ghostly clover? God, till you stirred in your sleep and were wild afraid. Well, we have passed. We are chronicle now to the eerie, curious metal from meteors that failed in the sky. Earthborn the tireless is stretched by the water, quite weary, close to this ununderstandable changeling that's I. Fear is an echo we trace to security's daughter. Now we are faces and voices, and less, too soon, whispering half love over the lilt of the water, youth, the penny that brought delight of the moon. A poem Amory sent to Eleanor, which he called Summer Storm. Faint winds, and a song fading and leaves falling, faint winds and far away a fading laughter, and the rain, and over the fields a voice calling. Our gray-blown cloud scurries and lifts above, slides on the sun and flutters there to waft her sisters on. The shadow of a dove falls on the coat, the trees are filled with wings, and down the valley through the crying trees the body of the darker storm flies, brings with its new air the breath of sunken seas and slender, tenuous thunder. But I wait. Wait for the mists and for the blacker rain, heavier winds that stir the veil of fate, happier winds that pile her hair again. They tear me, teach me, strew the heavy air upon me, winds that I know, and storm. There was a summer every rain was rare, there was a season every wind was warm, and now you pass me in the mist, your hair rain-blown about you, damp lips curved once more in that wild irony, that gay despair that made you old when we have met before. Wraith-like you drift on out before the rain. Across the fields, blown with the stemless flowers, with your old hopes, dead leaves and loves again. Dim as a dream and wan with all old hours, whispers will creep into the growing dark, tumult will die over the trees. Now night. Tears from her wetted breast, the splattered blouse of day, glides down the dreaming hills, tear-bright, to cover with her hair the eerie green. Love for the dusk, love for the glistening after. Quiet, the trees, to their last tops, serene. Faint winds, and far away a fading laughter. End of Book 2, Chapter 3, Part 2.
Book 2, Chapter 4 of This Side of Paradise. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Book 2, The Education of a Personage. Chapter 4, The Supercilious Sacrifice. Atlantic City. Amory paced the boardwalk at day's end, lulled by the everlasting surge of changing waves, smelling the half-mournful odor of the salt breeze. The sea, he thought, had treasured its memories deeper than the faithless land. It seemed still to whisper of Norse galleys ploughing the water-world under raven-figured flags, of the British dreadnoughts, gray bulwarks of civilization, steaming up through the fog of one dark July into the North Sea. "Well, Amory Blaine!" Amory looked down into the street below. A low racing car had drawn to a stop, and a familiar, cheerful face protruded from the driver's seat. "Come on down, goofer!" cried Alec. Amory called a greeting, and descending a flight of wooden steps, approached the car. He and Alec had been meeting intermittently, but the barrier of Rosalind lay always between them. He was sorry for this. He hated to lose Alec. "Mr. Blaine, this is Miss Watterson, Miss Wayne, and Mr. Tully." "How do you do?" "Amory," Alec said exuberantly, "if you'll jump in, we'll take you to some secluded nook and give you a wee jolt of bourbon." Amory considered. "That's an idea." "Step in. Move over, Jill, and Amory will smile very handsomely at you." Amory squeezed into the back seat beside a gaudy vermilion-lipped blonde. "Hello, Doug Fairbanks," she said flippantly. "Walking for exercise or hunting for company?" "I was counting the waves," replied Amory gravely. "I'm going in for statistics." "Don't kid me, Doug." When they reached an unfrequented side street, Alec stopped the car among deep shadows. "What you doing down here these cold days, Amory?" he demanded, as he produced a quart of bourbon from under the fur rug. Amory avoided the question. Indeed, he had had no definite reason for coming to the coast. "Do you remember that party of ours, sophomore year?" he asked instead. "Do I? When we slept in the pavilions up in Asbury Park?" "Lord, Alec, it's hard to think that Jesse and Dick and Kerry are all three dead." Alec shivered. "Don't talk about it. These dreary fall days depress me enough." Jill seemed to agree. "Doug here is sort of gloomy anyways," she commented. "Tell him to drink deep. It's good and scarce these days." "What I really want to ask you, Amory, is where you are—" "Why, New York, I suppose." "I mean tonight, because if you haven't got a room yet, you'd better help me out." "Glad to." "You see, Tully and I have 2 rooms with bath between at the Rainier, and he's got to go back to New York. I don't want to have to move. Question is, will you occupy one of the rooms?" Amory was willing, if he could get in right away. "You'll find the key in the office. The rooms are in my name." Declining further locomotion or further stimulation, Amory left the car and sauntered back along the boardwalk to the hotel. He was in an eddy again, a deep, lethargic gulf, without desire to work or write, love or dissipate. For the first time in his life, he rather longed for death to roll over his generation, obliterating their petty fevers and struggles and exultations. His youth seemed never so vanished as now, in the contrast between the utter loneliness of this visit and that riotous, joyful party of 4 years before. Things that had been the merest commonplaces of his life then, deep sleep, the sense of beauty around him, all desire, had flown away, and the gaps they left were filled only with the great listlessness of his disillusion. To hold a man, a woman has to appeal to the worst in him. This sentence was the thesis of most of his bad nights, of which he felt this was to be one. His mind had already started to play variations on the subject. Tireless passion, fierce jealousy, longing to possess and crush. These alone were left of all his love for Rosalind. These remained to him as payment for the loss of his youth. Bitter calomel under the thin sugar of love's exultation. In his room he undressed, and wrapping himself in blankets to keep out the chill October air, drowsed in an armchair by the open window. He remembered a poem he had read months before. "O staunch old heart who toiled so long for me, I waste my years sailing along the sea." Yet he had no sense of waste, no sense of the present hope that waste implied. He felt that life had rejected him. Rosalind, Rosalind. He poured the words softly into the half-darkness until she seemed to permeate the room. The wet salt breeze filled his hair with moisture. The rim of a moon seared the sky and made the curtains dim and ghostly. He fell asleep. When he awoke it was very late and quiet. The blanket had slipped partly off his shoulders, and he touched his skin to find it damp and cold. Then he became aware of a tense whispering, not 10 feet away. He became rigid. "Don't make a sound." It was Alec's voice. "Jill, do you hear me?" "Yes," breathed very low, very frightened. They were in the bathroom. Then his ears caught a louder sound from somewhere along the corridor outside. It was a mumbling of men's voices and a repeated muffled rapping. Amory threw off the blankets and moved close to the bathroom door. "My God," came the girl's voice again. "You'll have to let them in." "Shh!" Suddenly, a steady, insistent knocking began at Amory's hall door, and simultaneously out of the bathroom came Alec, followed by the vermilion-lipped girl. They were both clad in pajamas. "Amory!" An anxious whisper. "What's the trouble?" "It's house detectives. My God, Amory, they're just looking for a test case." "Well, better let them in." "You don't understand. They can get me under the Mann Act." The girl followed him slowly, a rather miserable, pathetic figure in the darkness. Amory tried to plan quickly. "You make a racket and let them in your room," he suggested anxiously, "and I'll get her out by this door." "They're here too, though. They'll watch this door." "Can't you give a wrong name?" "No chance. I registered under my own name. Besides, they'd trail the auto license number." "Say you're married." "Jill says one of the house detectives knows her." The girl had stolen to the bed and tumbled upon it, lay there listening wretchedly to the knocking which had grown gradually to a pounding. Then came a man's voice, angry and imperative. "Open up, or we'll break the door in." In the silence, when this voice ceased, Amory realized that there were other things in the room besides people. Over and around the figure crouched on the bed there hung an aura, gossamer as a moonbeam, tainted as stale, weak wine, yet a horror, diffusely brooding already over the three of them, and over by the window among the stirring curtains stood something else, featureless and indistinguishable, yet strangely familiar. Simultaneously, two great cases presented themselves side by side to Amory. All that took place in his mind, then, occupied in actual time less than 10 seconds. The first fact that flashed radiantly on his comprehension was the great impersonality of sacrifice. He perceived that what we call love and hate, reward and punishment, had no more to do with it than the date of the month. He quickly recapitulated the story of a sacrifice he had heard of in college. A man had cheated in an examination. His roommate, in a gust of sentiment, had taken the entire blame. Due to the shame of it, the innocent one's entire future seemed shrouded in regret and failure, capped by the ingratitude of the real culprit. He had finally taken his own life. Years afterward, the facts had come out. At the time, the story had both puzzled and worried Amory. Now he realized the truth, that sacrifice was no purchase of freedom. It was like a great elective office. It was like an inheritance of power, to certain people at certain times an essential luxury, carrying with it not a guarantee but a responsibility, not a security but an infinite risk. Its very momentum might drag him down to ruin. The passing of the emotional wave that made it possible might leave the one who made it high and dry forever on an island of despair. Amory knew that afterward Alec would secretly hate him for having done so much for him. All this was flung before Amory like an open scroll, while ulterior to him and speculating upon him were those two breathless, listening forces. The gossamer aura that hung over and about the girl, and that familiar thing by the window. Sacrifice by its very nature was arrogant and impersonal. Sacrifice should be eternally supercilious. Weep not for me, but for thy children. That, thought Amory, would be somehow the way God would talk to me. Amory felt a sudden surge of joy, and then, like a face in a motion picture, the aura over the bed faded out. The dynamic shadow by the window, that was as near as he could name it, remained for the fraction of a moment, and then the breeze seemed to lift it swiftly out of the room. He clenched his hands in quick, ecstatic excitement. The 10 seconds were up. "Do what I say, Alec. Do what I say. Do you understand?" Alec looked at him dumbly, his face a tableau of anguish. "You have a family," continued Amory slowly. "You have a family, and it's important that you should get out of this. Do you hear me?" He repeated clearly what he had said. "Do you hear me?" "I hear you." The voice was curiously strained. The eyes never for a second left Amory's. "Alec, you're going to lie down here. If anyone comes in, you act drunk. You do what I say. If you don't, I'll probably kill you." There was another moment while they stared at each other. Then Amory went briskly to the bureau and, taking his pocketbook, beckoned peremptorily to the girl. He heard one word from Alec that sounded like penitentiary. Then he and Jill were in the bathroom with the door bolted behind them. "You're here with me," he said sternly. "You've been with me all evening." She nodded, gave a little half cry. In a second he had the door of the other room open and 3 men entered. There was an immediate flood of electric light, and he stood there blinking. "You've been playing a little too dangerous a game, young man." Amory laughed. "Well?" The leader of the trio nodded authoritatively at a burly man in a check suit. "All right, Olson." "I've got you, Mr. O'May," said Olson, nodding. The other 2 took a curious glance at their quarry and then withdrew, closing the door angrily behind them. The burly man regarded Amory contemptuously. "Didn't you ever hear of the Mann Act? Coming down here with her," he indicated the girl with his thumb, "with a New York license on your car, to a hotel like this?" He shook his head, implying that he had struggled over Amory, but now gave him up. "Well," said Amory rather impatiently, "what do you want us to do?" "Get dressed, quick, and tell your friend not to make such a racket." Jill was sobbing noisily on the bed, but at these words she subsided sulkily and, gathering up her clothes, retired to the bathroom. As Amory slipped into Alec's BVDs, he found that his attitude toward the situation was agreeably humorous. The aggrieved virtue of the burly man made him want to laugh. "Anybody else here?" demanded Olson, trying to look keen and ferret-like. "Fellow who had the rooms," said Amory carelessly. "He's drunk as an owl, though. Been in there asleep since 6 o'clock." "I'll take a look at him presently." "How did you find out?" asked Amory curiously. "Night clerk saw you go upstairs with this woman." Amory nodded. Jill reappeared from the bathroom, completely if rather untidily arrayed. "Now then," began Olson, producing a notebook, "I want your real names, no damn John Smith or Mary Brown." "Wait a minute," said Amory quietly. "Just drop that big bully stuff. We merely got caught, that's all." Olson glared at him. "Name?" he snapped. Amory gave his name and New York address. "And the lady?" "Miss Jill—" "Say," said Olson indignantly, "just ease up on the nursery rhymes. What's your name? Sarah Murphy? Minnie Jackson?" "Oh, my God!" cried the girl, cupping her tear-stained face in her hands. "I don't want my mother to know. I don't want my mother to know." "Come on, now." "Shut up!" cried Amory at Olson. An instant's pause. "Stella Robbins," she faltered finally. "General Delivery, Rugway, New Hampshire." Olson snapped his notebook shut and looked at them very ponderously. "By rights, the hotel could turn the evidence over to the police, and you'd go to the penitentiary, you would, for bringing a girl from one state to another for immoral purposes." He paused to let the majesty of his words sink in. "But the hotel is going to let you off." "It doesn't want to get in the papers," cried Jill fiercely. "Let us off, huh?" A great lightness surrounded Amory. He realized that he was safe, and only then did he appreciate the full enormity of what he might have incurred. "However," continued Olson, "there's a protective association among the hotels. There's been too much of this stuff, and we've got arrangement with the newspapers so that you get a little free publicity. Not the name of the hotel, but just a line saying that you had a little trouble in Atlantic City, see?" "I see." "You're getting off light. Damn light. But—" "Come on," said Amory briskly. "Let's get out of here. We don't need a valedictory." Olson walked through the bathroom and took a cursory glance at Alec's still form. Then he extinguished the lights and motioned them to follow him. As they walked into the elevator, Amory considered a piece of bravado, yielded finally. He reached out and tapped Olson on the arm. "Would you mind taking off your hat? There's a lady in the elevator." Olson's hat came off slowly. There was a rather embarrassing 2 minutes under the lights of the lobby, while the night clerk and a few belated guests stared at them curiously. The loudly dressed girl with bent head, the handsome young man with his chin several points aloft. The inference was quite obvious. Then the chill outdoors, where the salt air was fresher and keener, still with the first hints of morning. "You can get one of those taxis and beat it," said Olson, pointing to the blurred outline of 2 machines whose drivers were presumably asleep inside. "Goodbye," said Olson. He reached in his pocket suggestively, but Amory snorted, and taking the girl's arm, turned away. "Where did you tell the driver to go?" she asked as they whirled along the dim street. "The station." "If that guy writes my mother—" "He won't. Nobody'll ever know about this except our friends and enemies." Dawn was breaking over the sea. "It's getting blue," she said. "It does very well," agreed Amory critically, and then as an afterthought, "It's almost breakfast time. Do you want something to eat?" "Food," she said with a cheerful laugh. "Food is what queered the party. We ordered a big supper to be sent up to the room about 2 o'clock. Alec didn't give the waiter a tip, so I guess the little bastard snitched." Jill's low spirits seemed to have gone faster than the scattering night. "Let me tell you," she said emphatically, "when you want to stage that sort of party, stay away from liquor, and when you want to get tight, stay away from bedrooms." "I'll remember." He tapped suddenly at the glass, and they drew up at the door of an all-night restaurant. "Is Alec a great friend of yours?" asked Jill, as they perched themselves on high stools inside and set their elbows on the dingy counter. "He used to be. He probably won't want to be any more, and never understand why." "It was sort of crazy, you taking all that blame. Is he pretty important? Kind of more important than you are?" Amory laughed. "That remains to be seen," he answered. "That's the question." The collapse of several pillars. 2 days later, back in New York, Amory found in a newspaper what he had been searching for. A dozen lines, which announced, to whom it might concern, that Mr. Amory Blaine, who gave his address as, etc., had been requested to leave his hotel in Atlantic City because of entertaining in his room a lady not his wife. Then he started, and his fingers trembled, for directly above was a longer paragraph of which the first words were: "Mr. and Mrs. Leland R. Connage are announcing the engagement of their daughter, Rosalind, to Mr. J. Dawson Ryder, of Hartford, Connecticut." He dropped the paper and lay down on his bed with a frightened, sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach. She was gone, definitely, finally gone. Until now he had half unconsciously cherished the hope deep in his heart that some day she would need him and send for him, cry that it had been a mistake, that her heart ached only for the pain she had caused him. Never again could he find even the somber luxury of wanting her, not this Rosalind, harder, older, nor any beaten, broken woman that his imagination brought to the door of his 40s. Amory had wanted her youth, the fresh radiance of her mind and body, the stuff that she was selling now once and for all. So far as he was concerned, young Rosalind was dead. A day later came a crisp, terse letter from Mr. Barton in Chicago, which informed him that as 3 more streetcar companies had gone into the hands of receivers, he could expect for the present no further remittances. Last of all, on a dazed Sunday night, a telegram told him of Monsignor Darcy's sudden death in Philadelphia 5 days before. He knew then what it was that he had perceived among the curtains of the room in Atlantic City. End of Part 2, Chapter 4.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Claire Goget. This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Book 2, The Education of a Personage. Chapter 5. Part 1. The Egotist Becomes a Personage. A fathom deep in sleep I lie, with old desires restrained before, to clamor lifeward with a cry, as dark flies out the graying door. And so in quest of creeds to share, I seek assertive day again, but old monotony is there, endless avenues of rain. Oh, might I rise again, might I throw off the heat of that old wine, see the new morning mask the sky, with fairy towers line on line, find each mirage in the high air, a symbol not a dream again, but old monotony is there, endless avenues of rain. Under the glass portcullis of a theatre, Amory stood, watching the first great drops of rain splatter down and flatten to dark stains on the sidewalk. The air became gray and opalescent, a solitary light suddenly outlined a window over the way, then another light, then 100 more danced and glimmered into vision. Under his feet a thick iron-studded skylight turned yellow, In the street, the lamps of the taxicabs sent out glistening sheens along the already black pavement. The unwelcome November rain had perversely stolen the day's last hour, and pawned it with that ancient fence, the night. The silence of the theater behind him ended with a curious snapping sound, followed by the heavy roaring of a rising crowd, and the interlaced clatter of many voices. The matinee was over. He stood aside, edged a little into the rain to let the throng pass. A small boy rushed out, sniffed in the damp, fresh air, and turned up the collar of his coat. Came 3 or 4 couples in a great hurry. Came a further scattering of people whose eyes as they emerged glanced invariably, first at the wet street, then at the rain-filled air, finally at the dismal sky. Last, a dense, strolling mass that depressed him with its heavy odor, compounded of the tobacco smell of the men and the fetid sensuousness of stale powder on women. After the thick crowd came another scattering. A stray half-dozen, a man on crutches. Finally, the rattling bang of folding seats inside announced that the ushers were at work. New York seemed not so much awakening as turning over in its bed. Pallid men rushed by, pinching together their coat collars. A great swarm of tired magpie girls from a department store crowded along with shrieks of strident laughter. 3 to an umbrella. A squad of marching policemen passed, already miraculously protected by oilskin capes. The rain gave Amory a feeling of detachment, and the numerous unpleasant aspects of city life without money occurred to him in threatening procession. There was the ghastly, stinking crush of the subway, the cards thrusting themselves at one, leering out like dull boars who grab your arm with another story, the querulous worry as to whether someone isn't leaning on you, a man deciding not to give his seat to a woman, hating her for it, the woman hating him for not doing it. At worst, a squalid phantasmagoria of breath, and old cloth on human bodies, and the smell of the food men ate. At best, just people, too hot or too cold, tired, worried. He pictured the rooms where these people lived, where the patterns of the blistered wallpapers were heavy reiterated sunflowers on green and yellow backgrounds, where there were tin bathtubs in gloomy hallways, and verdureless, unmameable spaces in back of the buildings, where even love dressed as seduction, a sordid murder around the corner, illicit motherhood in the flat above. And always there was the economical stuffiness of indoor winter, and the long summers, nightmares of perspiration between sticky, enveloping walls, dirty restaurants where careless, tired people helped themselves to sugar with their own used coffee spoons, leaving hard, brown deposits in the bowl. It was not so bad where there were only men or else only women. It was when they were vilely herded that it all seemed so rotten. It was some shame that women gave off at having men see them tired and poor. It was some disgust that men had for women who were tired and poor. It was dirtier than any battlefield he had seen, harder to contemplate than any actual hardship molded of mire and sweat and danger. It was an atmosphere wherein birth and marriage and death were loathsome, secret things. He remembered one day in the subway when a delivery boy had brought in a great funeral wreath of fresh flowers, how the smell of it had suddenly cleared the air and given everyone in the car a momentary glow. I detest poor people, thought Amory suddenly. I hate them for being poor. Poverty may have been beautiful once, but it's rotten now. It's the ugliest thing in the world. It's essentially cleaner to be corrupt and rich than it is to be innocent and poor. He seemed to see again a figure whose significance had once impressed him, a well-dressed young man gazing from a club window on Fifth Avenue, and saying something to his companion with a look of utter disgust. Probably, thought Amory, what he said was, "My God, aren't people horrible?" Never before in his life had Amory considered poor people. He thought cynically how completely he was lacking in all human sympathy. O. Henry had found in these people romance, pathos, love, hate. Amory saw only coarseness, physical filth, and stupidity. He made no self-accusations. Never any more did he reproach himself for feelings that were natural and sincere. He accepted all his reactions as a part of him, unchangeable, unmoral. This problem of poverty transformed, magnified, attached to some grander, more dignified attitude, might some day even be his problem. At present it roused only his profound distaste. He walked over to Fifth Avenue, dodging the blind, black menace of umbrellas, and standing in front of Delmonico's, hailed an autobus. Buttoning his coat closely around him, he climbed to the roof, where he rode in solitary state through the thin, persistent rain, stung into alertness by the cool moisture perpetually reborn on his cheek. Somewhere in his mind a conversation began, rather resumed its place in his attention. It was composed not of two voices, but of one, which acted alike as questioner and answerer. Question: "Well, what's the situation?" Answer: "That I have about $24 to my name." Question: "You have the Lake Geneva estate." Answer: "But I intend to keep it." Question: "Can you live?" Answer: "I can't imagine not being able to. People make money in books, and I've found that I can always do things that people do in books. Really, they are the only things I can do." Question: "Be definite." Answer: "I don't know what I'll do, nor have I much curiosity. Tomorrow I'm going to leave New York for good. It's a bad town unless you're on top of it." Question: "Do you want a lot of money?" Answer: "No, I am merely afraid of being poor." Question: "Very afraid?" Answer: "Just passively afraid." Question: "Where are you drifting?" Answer: "Don't ask me." Question: "Don't you care?" Answer: "Rather, I don't want to commit moral suicide." Question: "Have you no interests left?" Answer: "None. I've no more virtue to lose. Just as a cooling pot gives off heat, so all through youth and adolescence we give off calories of virtue. That's what's called ingenuousness." Question: "An interesting idea." Answer: "That's why a good man going wrong attracts people. They stand around and literally warm themselves at the calories of virtue he gives off. Sarah makes an unsophisticated remark, and the face simper in delight. How innocent the poor child is! They're warming themselves at her virtue. But Sarah sees the simper and never makes that remark again, only she feels a little colder after that." Question: "All your calories gone?" Answer: "All of them. I'm beginning to warm myself at other people's virtue." Question: "Are you corrupt?" Answer: "I think so. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about good and evil at all anymore." Question: "Is that a bad sign in itself?" Answer: "Not necessarily." Question: "What would be the test of corruption?" Answer: "Becoming really insincere, calling myself not such a bad fellow, thinking I regretted my lost youth when I only envy the delights of losing it. Youth is like having a big plate of candy. Sentimentalists think they want to be in the pure, simple state they were in before they ate the candy. They don't. They just want the fun of eating it all over again. The matron doesn't want to repeat her girlhood. She wants to repeat her honeymoon. I don't want to repeat my innocence. I want the pleasure of losing it again." Question: "Where are you drifting?" This dialogue merged grotesquely into his mind's most familiar state, a grotesque blending of desires, worries, exterior impressions, and physical reactions. 127th Street, or 137th Street. 2 and 3 look alike. No, not much. Seat damp. Are clothes absorbing wetness from seat, or seat absorbing dryness from clothes? Sitting on wet substance gave appendicitis, so Froggy Parker's mother said. Well, he'd had it. "I'll sue the steamboat company," Beatrice said, "and my uncle has a quarter interest." Did Beatrice go to heaven? Probably not. He represented Beatrice's immortality, also love affairs of numerous dead men who surely had never thought of him. If it wasn't appendicitis, influenza maybe. What? 120th Street? That must have been 112th back there. 102 instead of 127. Rosalind not like Beatrice. Eleanor like Beatrice, only wilder and brainier. Apartments along here expensive, probably 150 a month, maybe 200. Uncle had only paid 100 a month for a whole great big house in Minneapolis. Question: "Were the stairs on the left or right as you came in?" Anyway, in 12 Univee they were straight back and to the left. What a dirty river! Want to go down there and see if it's dirty? French rivers all brown or black, so were Southern rivers. $24 meant 480 doughnuts. He could live on it 3 months and sleep in the park. Wonder where Jill was. Jill Bain, Fane, Sane, what the devil? Neck hurts, darned uncomfortable seat. No desire to sleep with Jill. What could Alec see in her? Alec had a coarse taste in women. Own taste the best. Isabel, Clara, Rosalind, Eleanor were all American. Eleanor would pitch probably southpaw. Rosalind was outfield, wonderful hitter. Clara first base, maybe. Wonder what Humbird's body looked like now. If he himself hadn't been bayonet instructor, he'd have gone up to line 3 months sooner, probably been killed. Where's the darned bell? The street numbers of Riverside Drive were obscured by the mist and dripping trees from anything but the swiftest scrutiny, but Amory had finally caught sight of one, 127th Street. He got off and with no distinct destination followed a winding descending sidewalk and came out facing the river, in particular a long pier and a partitioned litter of shipyards for miniature craft, small launches, canoes, rowboats, and catboats. He turned northward and followed the shore, jumped a small wire fence, and found himself in a great disorderly yard adjoining a dock. The hulls of many boats in various stages of repair were around him. He smelled the sawdust and paint and the scarcely distinguishable fiat odor of the Hudson. A man approached through the heavy gloom. "Hello," said Amory. "Got a pass?" "No. Is this private?" "This is the Hudson River Sporting and Yacht Club." "Oh, I didn't know. I'm just resting." "Well," began the man dubiously, "I'll go if you want me to." The man made non-committal noises in his throat and passed on. Amory sedated himself on an overturned boat and leaned forward thoughtfully until his chin rested in his hand. "Misfortune is liable to make me a damn bad man," he said slowly. In the drooping hours. While the rain drizzled on, Amory looked futilely back at the stream of his life, all its glittering and dirty shallows. To begin with, he was still afraid, not physically afraid any more, but afraid of people and prejudice and misery and monotony. Yet deep in his bitter heart he wondered if he was after all worse than this man or the next. He knew that he could sophisticate himself finally into saying that his own weakness was just the result of circumstances and environment. That often when he raged at himself, as an egotist, something would whisper ingratiatingly, "No, genius!" That was one manifestation of fear, that voice which whispered that he could not be both great and good, that genius was the exact combination of those inexplicable grooves and twists in his mind, that any discipline would curb it to mediocrity. Probably more than any concrete vice or failing, Amory despised his own personality. He loathed knowing that tomorrow and the 1,000 days after he would swell pompously at a compliment and sulk at an ill word like a third-rate musician or a first-class actor. He was ashamed of the fact that very simple and honest people usually distrusted him, that he had been cruel often to those who had sunk their personalities in him. Several girls and a man here and there through college that he had been an evil influence on, people who had followed him here and there into mental adventures from which he alone rebounded unscathed. Usually on nights like this, for there had been many lately, he could escape from this consuming introspection by thinking of children and the infinite possibilities of children. He leaned and listened, and he heard a startled baby awake in a house across the street and lend a tiny whimper to the still night. Quick as a flash he turned away, wondering with a touch of panic whether something in his brooding despair of his mood had made a darkness in its tiny soul. He shivered. What if some day the balance was overturned, and he became a thing that frightened children and crept into rooms in the dark, approached dim communion with those phantoms who whispered shadowy secrets to the mad of the dark continent upon the moon? Amory smiled a bit. "You're too much wrapped up in yourself," he heard someone say, and again, "Get out and do some real work. Stop worrying." He fancied a possible future comment of his own. "Yes, I was perhaps an egotist in youth, but I soon found it made me morbid to think too much about myself." Suddenly he felt an overwhelming desire to let himself go to the devil. Not to go violently as a gentleman should, but to sink safely and sensuously out of sight. He pictured himself in an adobe house in Mexico, half reclining on a rug-covered couch, his slender, artistic fingers closed on a cigarette, while he listened to guitars strumming melancholy undertones to an age-old dirge of Castile, and an olive-skinned, carmine-lipped girl caressed his hair. Here he might live a strange litany, delivered from right and wrong, and from the hound of heaven and from every god. except the exotic Mexican, who was pretty slack himself and rather addicted to Oriental scents. Delivered from success and hope and poverty into that long chute of indulgence, which led, after all, only to the artificial lake of death. There were so many places where one might deteriorate pleasantly. Port Said, Shanghai, parts of Turkestan, Constantinople, the South Seas, all lands of sad, haunting music and many odors, where lust could be a mode and expression of life, where the shades of night skies and sunset would seem to reflect only moods of passion, the colors of lips and poppies. Once he had been miraculously able to scent evil as a horse detects a broken bridge at night, but the man with the queer feet in Phoebe's room had diminished to the aura over Jill. His instinct perceived the fetidness of poverty, but no longer fretted out the deeper evils in pride and sensuality. There were no more wise men, there were no more heroes. Burne Holiday was sunk from sight as though he had never lived. Monseigneur was dead. Amory had grown up to 1,000 books, 1,000 lies. He had listened eagerly to people who pretended to know, who knew nothing. The mystical reveries of saints that had once filled him with awe in the still hours of night now vaguely repelled him. The Byrons and Brookes who had defied life from mountain-tops were in the end but flâneurs and posers, at best mistaking the shadows of courage for the substance of wisdom. The pageantry of his delusion took shape in a world-old procession of prophets, Athenians, martyrs, saints, scientists, Don Juans, Jesuits, Puritans, Fausts, poets, pacifists. Like costumed alumni at a college reunion, they streamed before him as their dreams, personalities, and creeds had in turn thrown colored lights on his soul. Each had tried to express the glory of life and the tremendous significance of man. Each had boasted of synchronizing what had gone before into his own rickety generalities. Each had depended, after all, on the set stage and the convention of the theater, which is that man, in his hunger for faith, will feed his mind with the nearest and most convenient food. Women, of whom he had expected so much, whose beauty he had hoped to transmute into modes of art, whose unfathomable instincts, marvelously incoherent and inaccurate, he had thought to perpetuate in terms of experience, had become merely consecrations to their own posterity. Isabel, Clara, Rosalind, Eleanor were all removed by their very beauty, around which men had swarmed, from the possibility of contributing anything but a sick heart and a page of puzzled words to write. Amory based his loss of faith and help from others on several sweeping syllogisms. Granted that his generation, however bruised and decimated from this Victorian war, were the heirs of progress. Waving aside petty differences of conclusions which, although they might occasionally cause the deaths of several millions of young men, might be explained away, supposing that after all Bernard Shaw and Bernardi, Bonner Law and Bethune Hollweg were mutual heirs of progress, if only in agreeing against the ducking of witches, waving the antitheses and approaching individually these men who seemed to be the leaders, he was repelled by the discrepancies and contradictions in the men themselves. There was, for example, Thornton Hancock, respected by half the intellectual world as an authority on life, a man who had verified and believed the code he lived by, an educator of educators, an adviser to presidents. Yet Amory knew that this man had in his heart leaned on the priest of another religion. And Monseigneur, upon whom a cardinal rested, had moments of strange and horrible insecurity, inexplicable in a religion that explained even disbelief in terms of its own faith. If you doubted the devil, it was the devil that made you doubt him. Amory had seen Monseigneur go to the houses of stolid Philistines, read popular novels furiously, saturate himself in routine to escape from that horror. And this priest, a little wiser, somewhat purer, had been, Amory knew, not essentially older than he. Amory was alone. He had escaped from a small enclosure into a great labyrinth. He was where Goethe was when he began Faust. He was where Conrad was when he wrote Almayer's Folly. Amory said to himself that there were essentially two sorts of people who through natural clarity of disillusion left the enclosure and sought the labyrinth. There were men like Wells and Plato, who had, half unconsciously, a strange hidden orthodoxy, who would accept for themselves only what could be accepted for all men. incurable romanticists who never, for all their efforts, could enter the labyrinth of stark souls. There were, on the other hand, sword-like pioneering personalities, Samuel Butler, Renan, Voltaire, who progressed much slower, yet eventually much further, not in the direct pessimistic line of speculative philosophy, but concerned in the eternal attempt to attach a positive value to life. Amory stopped. He began, for the first time in his life, to have a strong distrust of all generalities and epigrams. They were too easy, too dangerous to the public mind. Yet all thought usually reached the public after 30 years in some such form. Benson and Chesterton had popularized Huysman and Newman. Shaw had sugar-coated Nietzsche, and Ibsen and Schopenhauer. The man in the street heard the conclusions of dead genius through someone else's clever paradoxes and didactic epigrams. Life was a damned muddle. A football game with everyone offside and the referee gotten rid of, everyone claiming the referee would have been on his side. Progress was a labyrinth. People plunging blindly in and then rushing wildly back, shouting that they had found it, the invisible king, the élan vital, the principle of evolution, writing a book, starting a war, founding a school. Amory, even had he not been a selfish man, would have started all inquiries with himself. He was his own best example, sitting in the rain, a human creature of sex and pride, foiled by chance and his own temperament, of the balm of love and children, preserved to help in building up the living consciousness of the race. In self-reproach and loneliness and disillusion he came to the entrance of the labyrinth. A belated taxi hurried along the street, its lamps still shining like burning eyes in a face white from a night's carouse. A melancholy siren sounded far down the river. Monseigneur. Amory kept thinking how Monseigneur would have enjoyed his own funeral. It was magnificently Catholic and liturgical. Bishop O'Neill sang solemn high mass and the cardinal gave the final absolutions. Thornton Hancock, Mrs. Lawrence, the British and Italian ambassadors, the papal delegate, and a host of friends and priests were there. Yet the inexorable shears had cut through all these threads that Monseigneur had gathered into his hands. To Amory it was a haunting grief to see him lying in his coffin, with closed hands upon his purple vestments. His face had not changed, and as he never knew he was dying, it showed no pain or fear. It was Amory's dear old friend, his and the others', for the church was full of people with daft, staring faces, the most exalted seeming the most stricken. The cardinal, like an archangel in cope and murder, sprinkled the holy water, the organ broke into sound, the choir began to sing the Requiem Aeternam. All these people grieved because they had to some extent depended upon Monseigneur. Their grief was more than sentiment for the crack in his voice, or a certain break in his walk, as Wells put it. These people had leaned on Monseigneur's faith, his way of finding cheer or making religion a thing of lights and shadows, making all light and shadow merely aspects of God. People felt safe when he was near. Of Amory's attempted sacrifice had been born merely the full realization of his disillusion, but of Monseigneur's funeral was born the romantic elf who was to enter the labyrinth with him. He found something that he wanted, had always wanted, and always would want, not to be admired, as he had feared, not to be loved, as he had made himself believe, but to be necessary to people, to be indispensable. He remembered the sense of security he had found in Byrne. Life opened up in one of its amazing bursts of radiance, and Amory suddenly and permanently rejected an old epigram that had been playing listlessly in his mind. Very few things matter, and nothing matters very much. On the contrary, Amory felt an immense desire to give people a sense of security. End of Book 2, Chapter 5, Part 1.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ancilla. This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Book 2, The Education of a Personage. Chapter 5, The Egotist Becomes a Personage. Part 2, The Big Man with Goggles.
On the day that Amory started on his walk to Princeton, the sky was a colorless vault, cool, high, and barren of the threat of rain. It was a gray day, that least fleshly of all weathers, a day of dreams and far hopes and clear visions. It was a day easily associated with those abstract truths and purities that dissolve in the sunshine or fade out in mocking laughter by the light of the moon. The trees and clouds were carved in classical severity. The sounds of the countryside had harmonized to a monotone, metallic as a trumpet, breathless as a Grecian urn. The day had put Amory in such a contemplative mood that he caused much annoyance to several motorists who were forced to slow up considerably or else run him down. So engrossed in his thoughts was he that he was scarcely surprised at that strange phenomenon, cordiality manifested within 50 miles of Manhattan, when a passing car slowed down beside him and a voice hailed him. He looked up and saw a magnificent locomobile in which sat 2 middle-aged men, one of them small and anxious-looking, apparently an artificial growth on the other who was large and begoggled and imposing. "Do you want a lift?" asked the apparently artificial growth, glancing from the corner of his eye at the imposing man as if for some habitual silent corroboration. "You bet I do, thanks!" The chauffeur swung open the door, and, climbing in, Amory settled himself in the middle of the back seat. He took in his companions curiously. The chief characteristic of the big man seemed to be a great confidence in himself set off against a tremendous boredom with everything around him. That part of his face which protruded under the goggles was what is generally termed strong. Rolls of not undignified fat had collected near his chin. Somewhere above was a wide, thin mouth and a rough model for a Roman nose, and below, his shoulders collapsed without a struggle into the powerful bulk of his chest and belly. He was excellently and quietly dressed. Amory noticed that he was inclined to stare straight at the back of the chauffeur's head as if speculating steadily but hopelessly some baffling hirsute problem. The smaller man was remarkable only for his complete submersion in the personality of the other. He was of that lower secretarial type who at 40 have engraved upon their business cards "Assistant to the President," and without a sigh consecrate the rest of their lives to second-hand mannerisms. "Going far?" asked the smaller man in a pleasant, disinterested way. "Quite a stretch." "Hiking for exercise?" "No," responded Anne-Marie succinctly. "I'm walking because I can't afford to ride." "Oh." Then again, "Are you looking for work? Because there's lots of work," he continued rather testily. "All this talk of lack of work, the West is especially short of labor." He expressed the West with a sweeping lateral gesture. Amory nodded politely. "Have you a trade?" No, Amory had no trade. "Clerk, eh?" No, Amory was not a clerk. "Whatever your line is," said the little man, seeming to agree wisely with something Amory had said, "now is the time of opportunity and business openings." He glanced again toward the big man, as a lawyer grilling a witness glances involuntarily at the jury. Amory decided that he must say something, and for the life of him could think of only one thing to say. "Of course, I want a great lot of money." The little man laughed mirthlessly but conscientiously. "That's what everyone wants nowadays, but they don't want to work for it." A very natural, healthy desire. Almost all normal people want to be rich without great effort, except the financiers in problem plays, who want to crash their way through. Don't you want easy money? "Of course not," said the secretary indignantly. "But," continued Amory, disregarding him, "being very poor at present, I am contemplating socialism as possibly my forte." Both men glanced at him curiously. "These bomb throwers," the little man ceased as words lurched ponderously from the big man's chest. "If I thought you were a bomb thrower, I'd run you over to the Newark jail. That's what I think of socialists." Amory laughed. "What are you?" asked the big man. "One of these parlor Bolsheviks? One of these idealists? I must say I fail to see the difference. The idealists loaf around and write the stuff that stirs up the poor immigrants." "Well," said Amory, "if being an idealist is both safe and lucrative, I might try it." "What's your difficulty? Lost your job?" "Not exactly, but, well, call it that." "What is it?" "Writing copy for an advertising agency." "Lots of money in advertising." Amory smiled discreetly. "Oh, I'll admit there's money in it eventually. Talent doesn't starve you anymore. Even art gets enough to eat these days. Artists draw your magazine covers, write your advertisements, hash out ragtime for your theaters. By the great commercializing of printing, you've found a harmless, polite occupation for every genius who might have carved his own niche. But beware the artist who's an intellectual also, the artist who doesn't fit, the Rousseau, the Tolstoy, the Samuel Butler, the Amory Blaine. Who's he? Demanded the little man suspiciously. Well, said Amory, he's an intellectual personage, not very well known at present. The little man laughed his conscientious laugh, and stopped rather suddenly as Amory's burning eyes turned on him. What are you laughing at? These intellectual people. Do you know what it means? The little man's eyes twitched nervously. Why, it usually means... It always means brainy and well-educated, interrupted Amory. It means having an active knowledge of the race's experience. Amory decided to be very rude. He turned to the big man. The young man, he indicated the secretary with his thumb, and said young man as one says bellboy, with no implication of youth, has the usual muddled connotation of all popular words. You object to the fact that capital controls printing? Said the big man, fixing him with his goggles. Yes, and I object to doing their mental work for them. It seemed to me that the root of all the business I saw around me consisted in overworking and underpaying a bunch of dubs who submitted to it. Here now, said the big man, you'll have to admit that the laboring man is certainly highly paid. 5 and 6 hour days. It's ridiculous. You can't buy an honest day's work from a man in the trades unions. You've brought it on yourselves, insisted Amory. You people never make concessions until they're wrung out of you. What people? Your class. The class I belonged to until recently. Those who by inheritance or industry or brains or dishonesty have become the moneyed class. Do you imagine that if the road mender over there had the money, he'd be any more willing to give it up? No. But what's that got to do with it? The older man considered. No, I'll admit it hasn't. It rather sounds as if it had, though. In fact, continued Amory, he'd be worse. The lower classes are narrower, less pleasant, and personally more selfish, certainly more stupid, but all that has nothing to do with the question. Just exactly what is the question? Here, Amory had to pause and consider exactly what the question was. Amory coins a phrase. When life gets hold of a brainy man of fair education, began Amory slowly, that is, when he marries, he becomes, 9 times out of 10, a conservative as far as existing social conditions are concerned. He may be unselfish, kind-hearted, even just in his own way, but his first job is to provide and to hold fast. His wife shoos him on, from 10,000 a year to 20,000 a year, on and on in an enclosed treadmill that hasn't any windows. He's done. Life's got him. He's no help. He's a spiritually married man. Amory paused and decided that it wasn't such a bad phrase. Some men, he continued, escape the grip. Maybe their wives have no social ambitions. Maybe they've hit a sentence or two in a dangerous book that pleased them. Maybe they started on the treadmill as I did and were knocked off. Anyway, they're the congressmen you can't bribe, the presidents who aren't politicians, the writers, speakers, scientists, statesmen who aren't just popular grab bags for a half-dozen women and children. He's the natural radical? Yes, said Amory. He may vary from the disillusioned critic like old Thornton Hancock all the way to Trotsky. Now this spiritually unmarried man hasn't direct power, for unfortunately the spiritually married man, as a byproduct of his money chase, has garnered in the great newspaper, the popular magazine, the influential weekly, so that Mrs. Newspaper, Mrs. Magazine, Mrs. Weekly can have a better limousine than all those oil people across the street or those cement people round the corner. Why not? It makes wealthy men the keepers of the world's intellectual conscience, and, of course, a man who has money under one set of social institutions quite naturally can't risk his family's happiness by letting the clamor for another appear in his newspaper. But it appears, said the big man. Where? In the discredited mediums? Rotten cheap papered weeklies? All right, go on. Well, my first point is that through a mixture of conditions, of which the family is the first, there are these two sorts of brains. One sort takes human nature as it finds it, uses its timidity, its weakness, and its strength for its own ends. Opposed is the man who, being spiritually unmarried, continually seeks for new systems that will control or counteract human nature. His problem is harder. It is not life that's complicated, it's the struggle to guide and control life. That is his struggle. He is a part of progress. The spiritually married man is not. The big man produced 3 big cigars and proffered them on his huge palm. The little man took one. Amory shook his head and reached for a cigarette. "Go on talking," said the big man. "I've been wanting to hear one of you fellows." Going faster. "Modern life," began Amory again, "changes no longer century by century, but year by year, 10 times faster than it ever has before. Populations doubling, civilizations unified more closely with other civilizations, economic interdependence, racial questions, and we're dawdling along. My idea is that we've got to go very much faster." He slightly emphasized the last words, and the chauffeur unconsciously increased the speed of the car. Amory and the big man laughed. The little man laughed too, after a pause. "Every child," said Amory, "should have an equal start. If his father can endow him with a good physique, and his mother with some common sense in his early education, that should be his heritage. If the father can't give him a good physique, if the mother has spent in chasing men the years in which she should have been preparing herself to educate her children, so much the worse for the child. He shouldn't be artificially bolstered up with money, sent to these horrible tutoring schools, dragged through college. Every boy ought to have an equal start." "All right," said the big man, his goggles indicating neither approval nor objection. "Next, I'd have a fair trial of government ownership of all industries." "That's been proven a failure." "No, it merely failed. If we had government ownership, we'd have the best analytical business minds in the government working for something besides themselves. We'd have Mackays instead of Burlesons. We'd have Morgans in the Treasury Department. We'd have Hills running interstate commerce. We'd have the best lawyers in the Senate." "They wouldn't give their best efforts for nothing. Bk2 "No," said Amory, shaking his head. "Money isn't the only stimulus that brings out the best that's in a man, even in America." "You said a while ago that it was." "It is, right now. But if it were made illegal to have more than a certain amount, the best men would all flock for the one other reward that attracts humanity: honor." The big man made a sound that was very like boo. "That's the silliest thing you've said yet." "No, it isn't silly. It's quite plausible. If you'd gone to college, you'd have been struck by the fact that the men there would work twice as hard for any one of 100 petty honors as those other men did who were earning their way through." "Kids, child's play," scoffed his antagonist. "Not by a darned sight, unless we're all children. Did you ever see a grown man when he's trying for a secret society or a rising family whose name is up at some club? They'll jump when they hear the sound of a word. The idea that to make a man work you've got to hold gold in front of his eyes is a growth, not an axiom. We've done that for so long that we've forgotten there's any other way. We've made a world where that's necessary. Let me tell you," Amory became emphatic, "if there were 10 men insured against either wealth or starvation, and offered a green ribbon for 5 hours work a day and a blue ribbon for 10 hours work a day, 9 out of 10 of them would be trying for the blue ribbon. That competitive instinct only wants a badge. If the size of their house is the badge, they'll sweat their heads off for that. If it's only a blue ribbon, I damn near believe they'll work just as hard. They have in other ages." "I don't agree with you." "I know it," said Amory, nodding sadly. "It doesn't matter any more, though. I think these people are going to come and take what they want pretty soon." A fierce hiss came from the little man. "Machine guns." "Ah, but you've taught them their use." The big man shook his head. "In this country, there are enough property owners not to permit that sort of thing." Amory wished he knew the statistics of property owners and non-property owners. He decided to change the subject, but the big man was aroused. "When you talk of taking things away, you're on dangerous ground." "How can they get it without taking it? For years, people have been stalled off with promises. Socialism may not be progress, but the threat of the red flag is certainly the inspiring force of all reform. You've got to be sensational to get attention." "Russia is your example of beneficent violence, I suppose." Quite possibly, admitted Amory. Of course, it's overflowing just as the French Revolution did, but I've no doubt that it's really a great experiment and well worthwhile. Don't you believe in moderation? He won't listen to moderates, and it's almost too late. The truth is that the public has done one of those startling and amazing things that they do about once in 100 years. They've seized an idea. What is it? That however the brains and abilities of men may differ, their stomachs are essentially the same. The little man gets his. If you took all the money in the world, said the little man with much profundity, and divided it up Oh, shut up, said Amory briskly, and paying no attention to the little man's enraged stare, he went on with his argument. The human stomach, he began, but the big man interrupted rather patiently. I'm letting you talk, you know, he said, but please avoid stomachs. I've been feeling mine all day. Anyway, I don't agree with one half you've said. Government ownership is the basis of your whole argument, and it's invariably a beehive of corruption. Men won't work for blue ribbons. That's all rot. When he ceased, the little man spoke up with a determined nod, as if resolved this time to have his say out. There are certain things which are human nature, he asserted with an owl-like look, which always have been and always will be, which can't be changed. Amory looked from the small man to the big man helplessly. Listen to that! That's what makes me discouraged with progress. Listen to that! I can name offhand over 100 natural phenomena that have been changed by the will of man, 100 instincts in man that have been wiped out or are now held in check by civilization. What this man here just said has been for thousands of years the last refuge of the associated muttonheads of the world. It negates the efforts of every scientist, statesman, moralist, reformer, doctor, and philosopher that ever gave his life to humanity's service. It's a flat impeachment of all that's worthwhile in human nature. Every person over 25 years old who makes that statement in cold blood ought to be deprived of the franchise. The little man leaned back against the seat, his face purple with rage. Amory continued, addressing his remarks to the big man. These quarter-educated, stale-minded men, such as your friend here, who think they think every question that comes up, you'll find his type in the usual ghastly muddle. 1 minute it's the brutality and humanity of these Prussians. The next it's we ought to exterminate the whole German people. They always believe that things are in a bad way now, but they haven't any faith in these idealists. 1 minute they call Wilson just a dreamer, not practical. A year later they rail at him for making his dreams realities. They haven't clear logical ideas on one single subject except a sturdy, stolid opposition to all change. They don't think uneducated people should be highly paid, but they won't see that if they don't pay the uneducated people, their children are going to be uneducated too. And we're going round and round in a circle. That is the great middle class. The big man, with a broad grin on his face, leaned over and smiled at the little man. You're catching it pretty heavy, Garvin. How do you feel? The little man made an attempt to smile and act as if the whole matter were so ridiculous as to be beneath notice, but Amory was not through. The theory that people are fit to govern themselves rests on this man. If he can be educated to think clearly, concisely, and logically, freed of his habit of taking refuge in platitudes and prejudices and sentimentalisms, then I'm a militant socialist. If he can't, then I don't think it matters much what happens to man or his systems now or hereafter. I am both interested and amused, said the big man. You are very young. Which may only mean that I have neither been corrupted nor made timid by contemporary experience. I possess the most valuable experience, the experience of the race, for in spite of going to college, I've managed to pick up a good education. You talk lively. It's not all rubbish, cried Amory passionately. This is the first time in my life I've argued socialism. It's the only panacea I know. I'm restless. My whole generation is restless. I'm sick of a system where the richest man gets the most beautiful girl if he wants her, where the artist without an income has to sell his talents to a button manufacturer. Even if I had no talents, I'd not be content to work 10 years, condemned either to celibacy or a furtive indulgence to give some man's son an automobile. But if you're not sure, that doesn't matter, exclaimed Amory. My position couldn't be worse. A social revolution might land me on top. Of course I'm selfish. It seems to me I've been a fish out of water in too many outworn systems. I was probably one of the 24 men in my class at college who got a decent education. Still, they'd let any well-tutored flathead play football, and I was ineligible because some silly old men thought we should all profit by conic sections. I loathed the army. I loathed business. I'm in love with change, and I've killed my conscience. So, you'll go along crying that we must go faster, That at least is true, Amory insisted. Reform won't catch up to the needs of civilization unless it's made to. A laissez-faire policy is like spoiling a child by saying he'll turn out all right in the end. He will, if he's made to. But you don't believe all this socialist patter you talk. I don't know. Until I talked to you, I hadn't thought seriously about it. I wasn't sure of half of what I said. You puzzle me, said the big man, but you're all alike. They say Bernard Shaw, in spite of his doctrines, is the most exacting of all dramatists about his royalties, to the last farthing. Well, said Amory, I simply state that I'm a product of a versatile mind in a restless generation, with every reason to throw my mind and pen in with the radicals. Even if, deep in my heart, I thought we were all blind atoms in a world as limited as a stroke of a pendulum, I and my sort would struggle against tradition, try, at least, to displace old cants with new ones. I've thought I was right about life at various times, but faith is difficult. One thing I know. If living isn't a seeking for the grail, it may be a damned amusing game. For a minute, neither spoke, and then the big man asked, What was your university? Princeton. The big man became suddenly interested. The expression of his goggles altered slightly. I sent my son to Princeton. Did you? Perhaps you knew him. His name was Jesse Frenenby. He was killed last year in France. I knew him very well. In fact, he was one of my particular friends. He was quite a fine boy. We were very close. Amory began to perceive a resemblance between the father and the dead son, and he told himself that there had been all along a sense of familiarity. Jesse Ferreri, the man who in college had borne off the crown that he had aspired to. It was all so far away, what little boys they had been, working for blue ribbons. The car slowed up at the entrance to a great estate, ringed around by a huge hedge and a tall iron fence. Won't you come in for lunch? Amory shook his head. Thank you, Mr. Ferreri, but I've got to get on. The big man held out his hand. Amory saw that the fact that he had known Jesse more than outweighed any disfavor he had created by his opinions. What ghosts were people with which to work? Even the little man insisted on shaking hands. Goodbye, shouted Mr. Ferreri as the car turned the corner and started up the drive. Good luck to you, and bad luck to your theories. Same to you, sir, cried Amory, smiling and waving his hand. Out of the fire, out of the little room. 8 hours from Princeton, Amory sat down by the Jersey roadside and looked at the frostbitten country. Nature, as a rather coarse phenomenon, composed largely of flowers that, when closely inspected, appeared moth-eaten, and of ants that endlessly traversed blades of grass, was always disillusioning. Nature represented by skies and waters and far horizons was more likable. Frost and the promise of winter thrilled him now, made him think of a wild battle between St. Regis and Groton, ages ago, 7 years ago, and of an autumn day in France 12 months before, when he had lain in tall grass, his platoon flattened down close around him, waiting to tap the shoulders of a Lewis gunner. He saw the two pictures together with somewhat the same primitive exaltation. 2 games he had played, differing in quality of acerbity, linked in a way that differed them from Rosalind or the subject of labyrinths, which were, after all, the business of life. I am selfish, he thought. This is not a quality that will change when I see human suffering or lose my parents or help others. This selfishness is not only part of me, it is the most living part. It is by somehow transcending rather than by avoiding that selfishness that I can bring poise and balance into my life. There is no virtue of unselfishness that I cannot use. I can make sacrifices, be charitable, give to a friend, endure for a friend, lay down my life for a friend, all because these things may be the best possible expression of myself. Yet I have not one drop of the milk of human kindness. The problem of evil had solidified for Amory into the problem of sex. He was beginning to identify evil with the strong phallic worship in Brooke and the early Wells. Inseparably linked with evil was beauty, still a constant rising tumult, soft in Eleanor's voice, in an old song at night, riding deliriously through life like superimposed waterfalls, half rhythm, half darkness. Amory knew that every time he had reached toward it longingly, it had leered out at him with the grotesque face of evil. Beauty of great art, beauty of all joy, most of all the beauty of women. After all, it had too many associations with license and indulgence. Weak things were often beautiful, weak things were never good. And in this new loneness of his that had been selected for what greatness he might achieve, beauty must be relative or itself a harmony. It would make only a discord. In a sense, this gradual renunciation of beauty was the second step after his disillusion had been made complete. He felt that he was leaving behind him his chance of being a certain type of artist. It seemed so much more important to be a certain sort of man. His mind turned a corner suddenly, and he found himself thinking of the Catholic Church. The idea was strong in him that there was a certain intrinsic lack in those to whom orthodox religion was necessary, and religion to Amory meant the Church of Rome. Quite conceivably, it was an empty ritual, but it was seemingly the only assimilative traditionary bulwark against the decay of morals. Until the great mobs could be educated into a moral sense, someone must cry, "Thou shalt not!" Yet, any acceptance was, for the present, impossible. He wanted time, and the absence of ulterior pressure. He wanted to keep the tree without ornaments, realize fully the direction and momentum of this new start. The afternoon waned from the purging good of 3 o'clock to the golden beauty of 4. Afterward he walked through the dull ache of a setting sun, when even the clouds seemed bleeding, and at twilight he came to a graveyard. There was a dusky, dreamy smell of flowers, and the ghost of a new moon in the sky and shadows everywhere. On an impulse, he considered trying to open the door of a rusty iron vault built into the side of a hill. A vault washed clean and covered with late-blooming, weepy, watery blue flowers that might have grown from dead eyes, sticky to the touch with a sickening odor. Amory wanted to feel William Dayfield, 1864. He wondered that graves ever made people consider life in vain. Somehow, he could find nothing hopeless in having lived. All the broken columns and clasped hands and doves and angels meant romances. He fancied that in 100 years he would like having young people speculate as to whether his eyes were brown or blue, and he hoped quite passionately that his grave would have about it an air of many, many years ago. It seemed strange that, out of a row of Union soldiers, 2 or 3 made him think of dead loves and dead lovers, when they were exactly like the rest, even to the yellowish moss. Long after midnight, the towers and spires of Princeton were visible, with here and there a late burning light, and suddenly out of the clear darkness the sound of bells. As an endless dream it went on, the spirit of the past brooding over a new generation. The chosen youth from the muddled, unchastened world still fed romantically on the mistakes and half-forgotten dreams of dead statesmen and poets. Here was a new generation, shouting the old cries, learning the old creeds, through a reverie of long days and nights, destined finally to go out into that dirty gray turmoil to follow love and pride. A new generation dedicated more than the last to the fear of poverty and the worship of success. Grown up to find all gods dead, all wars fought, all faiths in man shaken. Amory, sorry for them, was still not sorry for himself. Art, politics, religion, whatever his medium should be, he knew he was safe now, free from all hysteria. He could accept what was acceptable, roam, grow, rebel, sleep deep through many nights. There was no God in his heart, he knew. His ideas were still in riot. There was ever the pain of memory, the regret for his lost youth, yet the waters of disillusion had left a deposit on his soul. Responsibility and a love of life, the faint stirring of old ambitions and unrealized dreams. But, oh, Rosalind, Rosalind. It's all a poor substitute at best, he said sadly. And he could not tell why the struggle was worthwhile, why he had determined to use the utmost himself and his heritage from the personalities he had passed. He stretched out his arms to the crystalline radiant sky. I know myself, he cried, but that is all. End of Book 2, Chapter 5, Part 2. End of This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald.